Welcome to this section. Here we're going to look at what I call 30-day resets. So another word for 30 days is a month. And the idea is to actually reset or reboot your genes. Now we talked about epigenetics. The whole idea of your genes aren't the ultimate controller, but the environment they live in. So this is about changing that. And it's a bit like rebooting your computer. If it's got unable to do things, you'll sometimes free it up and clean it up by rebooting it. So I look at this as the same idea as rebooting your computer is to rebooting your genes by changing what you eat and giving it at least a month to work that one out. And the primary one I actually recommend you start with, even though we've talked about eating less than 20 grams of carbohydrate a day, I actually recommend this one, which is the zero carb carnivore diet. There's many reasons I recommend that at the beginning. For some people say that's quite hard to do, but I have had people do that. So it's really the matter of, I started low carb when I went into this whole realm of going from my high carb vegetarian diet. I shifted to a low carb, high healthy fat diet, eating meat and vegetables. And then it took me several years to actually reduce the vegetables and go more to a zero carb carnivore diet. And if you're really looking at starting from scratch and really resetting and rebooting those genes, I think the zero carb carnivore diet deserves some deep respect there. So there's an interesting book by this guy, Alexander Stephenson, called The Fat of the Land, and that link on the PDF will take you straight to where you can see it on the web. But basically, he came out, he was basically an Inuit explorer, and he was in that same genre as like the early 20th century, in the early 1900s. That was when they started discovering vitamins and thinking that was such a big deal, and that was why one of the whole reasons that the vegetarian prominent people wanted to shift the diet to more of a plant-based diet back then, because they could prove the vitamins and minerals were in there. And so he came out and said, well, no, you don't need those things, because you can just eat on a zero carb diet like he'd done up in the Arctic, and showed you could do that. And he talks about his experience there. So I highly recommend that book if you want to read it. But you don't have to read it to understand the principle of it, which is, for eons, like I said in that slide, 200,000 years to now, before the agricultural age of the last 10,000 years, we were largely eating meat, fish, chicken, anything we could catch. And that was fundamentally the way we ate, and particularly if we were near the poles, there was not a lot of veggies happening, in most of the year. So there wasn't that year-round supermarket possibility of having tropical fruits and everything under the sun at your disposal. So the idea behind this one is to really eat when you're hungry and stop when you're satisfied. So it's not about stuffing yourself, it's just being nicely satisfied. And there is one idea of eating 2 grams of fat to every gram of protein you have. And if you have fatty cuts of meat, that'll just happen. So it's not about, again, adding fat unless you have a really low fat meal. So say example, chicken breast without the skin is very low fat. It's quite dry. You might find that nice to start with if you're being a vegetarian. Starting with chicken and fish is often a good entry point. But it took me years to actually get to eating steak, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And there's a group called the Paleo Medicina, or Medicina, Hungarian group, and they've been looking at the paleo diet and looking at the paleo carnivore diet. And the whole idea is that they back this idea that yes, zero carbs are a really good thing, and really look to getting really fatty cuts, so 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein. And then if you want to, if they say if you add vegetables, add actually the root vegetables, because they think cooked root vegetables are better than above ground salad vegetables. So there's interesting dynamics there and different twists on the vegetable story. And I laid out quite a bit about the above ground veggies in the last series. the last module, but I want you to bring this in now so that you could actually start to really think about which way you want to approach that. And I think starting from a zero carb carnivore diet is a good way that once you've gone into that and you want to add something to it, then maybe root vegetables, a little bit of root vegetables might be better. And again, try to keep it to that minimal amount. Try and get under the 20 grams so you're not eating a lot of it, and then you can work from there. So ruminants is our primary. It took me, I would think I was eating chicken and fish for several months before I smelt somebody having a steak at a restaurant. And I thought, oh, and before that I couldn't even consider the thought of being, and I might have told you the story already, I can't remember, but I couldn't even consider the thought of eating meat. But when I smelt that, I thought, well, that actually smells good. I'd like to try it. So then the next time we went out to a restaurant, I did try it, and I loved it. And the meat for me that I've settled down to in terms of my favorite meat to eat is what I know as a Scotch fillet. And when I looked at all the carnivore web pages and the Facebook pages, a lot of people were talking about their favorite meat, which was called a ribeye. And I thought, oh, it'd be nice to try one of those one day. But I know I like Scotch fillet, and it took me to use Google to realize that Scotch fillet and ribeye are actually the same cut of meat. So I think it's really interesting that it took me a while to re-equilibrate my body, as I have talked about that before, about working through that whole body type idea to see what the best meat for me was. And I came down to the same conclusion as most carnivores have, and that is ruminants are really our favorite foods. Fish and eggs came later. But all those things are good. And then the next thing about the zero carb diet is have water to thirst. So it's not about having bucket loads of water, it's just having it to thirst, and also having salt to taste. There was a reason for the salt trade, like I've talked about before, and it's really about not being afraid of salt and actually having it because it's a good thing to have. Now that's the carnivore diet. This one is the low carb, high fat diet, and this is the one we've largely talked about in the previous module. So it's basically eating when hungry, stopping when satisfied, eating basically diet on meat, chicken, fish, shellfish, and eggs. And in this slide, I created the slide a long time ago, but basically when you have that, you don't actually eat a lot of volume of meat. You actually have probably a bigger volume of vegetables, so that's why I put vegetables on the bottom. But then I've reduced the vegetables for myself, put carbohydrates down there. So you actually cut out a lot of these things, like I've said in previous slides. Oops, going too far. Need to. There we go. I'll stop there. So remember to cut out those things. Try, again, you could try at this point to add in root vegetables, a little bit of root vegetables, maybe like pumpkin, maybe like kumara, sweet potato, but just be really wary of that. And you've got those two choices of going above ground or below ground for veggies. The other thing a lot of people talk about is the idea of offal. The idea that when a lion hunts, the first thing it goes for is the liver. So any big predator like that does that. And when I was eating a lot more vegetables, I had cooked up meals like this, which is liver, a little bit of fresh ginger there and garlic, a little bit of other veggies, and just fry that up. And that's if you haven't enjoyed liver, for me that's a great way to enjoy liver, is to add some spices, ginger, garlic, whether it's fresh ginger or powdered ginger is up to you. And it's a really simple thing to do. Just cook that all up. And there are some people on the carnivore diet that really believe you need to eat nose to tail. And then there are other people that have survived 10, 20 years or more just on ribeye steaks. So you've really got to take that with a pinch of salt and play around with it according to your N=1 experiment. And I know for me, I'm in the phase now where I'm really preferring the steak rather than the liver. Liver, I kind of enjoyed liver at the beginning when I could play around with it, but at the moment I'm not enjoying it that much, so I only eat it very, very occasionally, not a regular thing, week over week. And there's a recipe there if you wanted to try that out. Other thing to look at is when you're adding in vegetables is a thing called the Autoimmune Protocol, and I taught one of my clients this, and this is some of her shots from the meals that she created. She was an artist, so it was really lovely to see those shots come back. And one of the good side about this is the Paleo Mom, or Paleo Mum as we'd call it here in New Zealand, rather than Mom. But if you've got an autoimmune disease, highly recommend you look at shifting your diet to low carb, high fat, and particularly shifting right back to carnivore. And then looking at, and when you look at this thing, you can see why that comes about like that, because you've got to take eggs out, because especially the whites can be a problem, nuts and seeds, even coffee, and seed-based spices, all the nightshades, even like the paprika and stuff like that, taking all the potential gluten foods out, limiting fructose consumption to the excess. I don't agree with all that Paleo Mum says. I think she's a bit more plant-based than I would want to be personally, but a lot of these other things I think are really important to lay out, and I've used her indicators here rather than try to recreate the wheel, because she's suffered autoimmune disease herself and done a lot of things with it. So again, aspirin, ibuprofen, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, that's what she's talking about. Non-nutritive sweeteners, like that's apart from things like stevia. I don't know what she thinks of monk fruit. I haven't looked at that. And then all the thickeners and things like that. So basically, she takes a whole bunch out, and a simple way to look at an autoimmune protocol is just to go to a carnivore diet and build it up from there. So we're about to talk about vegetarianism and veganism, and how to do low carb, high fat, or high healthy fat if you're a vegetarian or a vegan. And I just wanted to give a bit of a warning of that, because as you know, I've been a vegetarian for 35 years. 10 of those years was wheat-free vegan. I've been wheat-free since 1991. So what's that? Coming up to 30 years. So I was a wheat-free vegetarian and a wheat-free vegan. So I did that as I talked about before, I did a really good experiment on that, and bottom line, it didn't work for me. So I want to warn you about this. I know how challenging it can be to get out of the philosophical mindset of, ahimsa, no harm to animals and things like that, to really starting to appreciate that, well, I just need to accept what my body can deal with, and that needs to be good for me. But I also wanted to, if you had an issue with it, there's a great book called The Vegetarian Myth. If this is a real question of you, and it's hard for you to make that transition, this is a lady called Leah Keith, and basically she says she destroyed her health after 20 years of vegan eating. As I said, it's a very emotive and enlightening book, and she takes it from every perspective, from the health of the soil to the health of the planet, to the political thing, to the philosophical thing, to the religious thing. She covers all of those bases in this book, because it was a big deal for her to have to shift, but she owned up to the fact that it wasn't working for her body and she needed to change. But she needed to get her mind on board first before she could. So it was that whole process that she elucidates in this book. So I highly recommend you read that book if you're considering staying as a vegetarian or a vegan. And if you really must do that, must stay like that way, then here's some ideas on what you can do. The New Atkins for a New Year is where a lot of this list comes from. And basically it's to limit, as a vegetarian, carbohydrates to 30 grams a day. It's very hard to get below 20 as a vegetarian. And that's because, if you're eating, grains and things like that, and pulses, then you're going to be way over. So that's where you really need to look at, eating when hungry, stopping when satisfied. That doesn't change. If you can eat eggs, great, then you can put eggs in there. If you can eat cheese, great, you can add some cheese in there. Remember, limit it to 120 grams like we talked about a day. But you may not be able to do that. So then you're looking at soy products. It's better to introduce nuts and seeds before you introduce berries. You have again, a half to a cup a day of mixed above ground cooked veggies, or you can do a smaller amount of of root vegetables if you're following the more the paleo medicina look. Leafy greens, and your oils are going to need to be things like flaxseed, olive, and walnut. Again, water to thirst and salt to taste. You won't need to have as much salt as you might need in a carnivore diet because you know, all that carbohydrate, the extra carbohydrates you're going to be eating will actually, you know, help your body retain water. So you don't need to retain salt as well. So so these are some of the things you need to look at. And, you know, as I said, eliminate either the above ground or the below ground. I would actually play with one of those first. Decide whether you're going to be a little bit of below ground veggies cooked, or you're going to be a bit more of the above ground veggies, primarily uncooked. And again, that's up to you to play around with that and see what works best for your body. And now the vegan thing is the next step up from that, or the next step down, whichever way you want to take it. And here's an idea. So again, it becomes more and more difficult the less animal foods you're eating to actually get your carbohydrates right down. So the best you might be able to shoot for is about 50 grams of carbohydrate a day on a vegan diet. Again, you know, you're going to play around with, that's all the meats eliminated, and you're going to play around with eliminating fruits first. Some root veggies, that's the question mark between the paleo medicina and the you know, the below ground and above ground veggies, and then you're going to, you know, look at, you know, protein sources and things like that. So that's when you're looking at more like seeds. That's why I've left the seeds and the nuts in there. Soy products, soy and rice cheeses, seitan, which comes from soy, pulses, and high protein grains like quinoa. So you're just going to work around with that. And again, limit your veggies to a certain amount, play around with the idea of above ground or below ground, and look at, you know, more of the olive probably is, I'd probably go more for olive, avocado oil. I should actually update the slides at some point and put avocado oil in here. I think that's probably better than the flaxseed oil. And again, water to thirst, salt to taste. And hey, yeah, please remember that, you know, I honor the struggle it can be to let go of being vegan and vegetarian. But if you're open to it, I highly recommend you look at changing that. Just get your mind around it and your emotions around it, so you can actually make the change. But if you can't, at least know there are options for you.